The morning was not yet gray when Dorothy Marsh sat down at the writing desk that was not hers and put her hand on a letter that was not hers to read. She had already read it. That was the thing she could not change. She had come in at 5:30 to replace the candles before the household woke, had seen the papers fanned across the desk's surface, and assumed they were the household accounts she had been asked to collate. Had lifted the topmost sheet without thinking. And then the words had entered her, and she had not been able to stop them. By the time she understood what she held, she had already understood it completely. The fire had not yet been lit. Her hands were cold. Outside, the first carriages of the London morning were beginning their measured procession along Grosvenor Street, and inside Ashwick House the only sound was the slow tick of the long case clock in the corridor and the shallow, controlled rhythm of her own breathing. She set the letter down. She had read it twice. She now knew 3 things that she was not permitted to know. The first was that Lord Ashwick believed himself still owed a debt of £6,000, a debt of honor that had hung over the estate since his father's time, a chain he had never told anyone about, and that explained, now that she held the evidence, why the house had been quietly sold of 2 wing rooms of furniture, why he took no new horses, why he had refused the Dalwich Commission last spring and said only that it was not convenient. The second was that his late wife, the Marchioness Eliza, had paid the debt in full 17 months ago, in secret, through Mr. Prewett, the family solicitor, drawing the funds from her own marriage settlement without her husband's knowledge, because she had understood what the burden was doing to him, and had loved him too quietly and too steadily to wait for him to ask. The third was that Lady Constance Harfield had known about the payment for 6 weeks, had a letter from Mr. Prewett confirming it, and had chosen not to tell him. The letter on the desk was that letter, addressed from Prewett to Lady Constance and dated the 14th of October. And it had been left here. Left here, Dotty now thought, with the specific intention that it would eventually be filed away and forgotten. Another piece of paper in a house that ran on paper, and that Lord Ashwick would carry his false burden to the end of his days. Also in the letter, in the second paragraph, in Lady Constance's hand in pencil at the margin, a note. A note that named Dotty by position. The lady's maid was to be given notice before the quarter's end. The attachment was becoming visible. Dotty sat with her hands folded in her lap and did not move for a long time. She was not a woman given to catastrophizing. Her father had trained her out of it by the simple method of making her describe her fears precisely, out loud, until they took their actual shape and shrank to fit it. The habit had served her. She used it now. She described the situation precisely, out loud, in her own head, as her father had taught her. She had read a private letter. She was a servant who had read a private letter addressed to another person. If this were discovered, she would be dismissed without reference. She had information that, if it came to light through proper channels, would lift a £6,000 burden from the Marquis of Ashwick's shoulders, and would also expose Lady Constance Harfield as a woman who had knowingly permitted a grieving man to suffer under a false weight. She could not bring this information to light without revealing that she possessed it. She could not reveal that she possessed it without destroying her position, and very likely any position she might hope to obtain afterward, because a lady's maid who read private correspondence was not employable in any household that heard of it. She also could not unknow it. That was the simple, clean, unalterable fact at the center of everything else. She had read the letter. The words were in her now. Lord Ashwick's dead wife had paid a debt in secret to spare him, and he did not know it. And the woman currently managing his household knew and had chosen silence. And that silence was doing something quiet and systematic to a man who was already struggling to find a reason to move forward. She sat with this for a long time. The candles burned down. The clock ticked. The house began to wake around her by degrees, the first sounds of the kitchen staff below, the particular creak of the service stair that meant the under-housemaid was beginning her rounds. Then she rose and did her work. She had known, in the way one knows without naming it, that something had been forming between herself and the Marquis of Ashwick over the 3 months of her service in his house. She had known it the way her body knew it before her mind would permit the thought. The awareness of where he stood in any room she entered, the specific gravity of his attention when he looked at her, the silence that came over the corridor when he spoke her name. She had told herself it was proximity and circumstance, the natural surplus of feeling that a confined and formal household generates between two people who are both of them, in their different ways, alone. She had told herself this very firmly and had believed very little of it. Now she sat at a desk that was not hers, holding knowledge that was not hers to hold, and the question was not what she felt. The question was what she could do with what she knew, and whether she could do anything at all without destroying herself in the doing. She replaced the letter exactly as she had found it. She lit the candles. She left the room. The clock continued its tick. The carriages continued their passage. And Lord Richard Vane, Marquis of Ashwick, slept 2 floors above her, carrying a debt that had already been paid. She had no power in this house. She was Miss Marsh to the other servants, a lady's maid of 3 months' standing, the daughter of a dead schoolmaster from Shropshire who had left her nothing but his library and a brain too well furnished for her station. She had come to London because the Ashwick position paid £12 a year and offered a room that locked, and she had been grateful for both. She was not supposed to be able to read a letter in Latin and French mixed. She was not supposed to understand the legal shorthand of a solicitor's correspondence. Her father had taught her, as he taught himself, without stopping to consider what her life would look like when the instruction was finished. The knowledge sat inside her now, like something swallowed whole. She carried it through the days that followed with the careful steadiness of a person carrying water in a vessel they cannot set down. Lord Ashwick was not a warm man. He was not, in Dorothy's private assessment, a cruel man either, and she had a precise eye for cruelty, having been in enough households to recognize its various forms. He was a man in whom something had calcified. He moved through his own house with the quiet, methodical competence of someone executing an obligation, greeting his guests, answering his correspondence, attending his commitments, and doing none of it with any particular expectation of pleasure. He had the face of a man who had once expected things and had stopped. Gray eyes under straight, dark brows, a jaw that held itself carefully, the way a person holds themselves when they are accustomed to feeling too much and have decided not to. She noticed these things about him because she noticed everything. It was the particular quality of her training and her circumstance. The schoolmaster's daughter in the servant's position sees from every angle and files what she sees. Lady Constance had noticed her noticing. Lady Constance was no fool. The household had a rhythm that Dotty had learned inside a week, because learning it was the work, and she was good at the work. Lord Ashwick rose at 7 and was in his study by 1:30, and the study was not to be disturbed before 10 o'clock unless the house was burning. Lady Constance rose at 9 and held a brief empire from the blue sitting room between 10 and noon, during which time she received callers, wrote notes, and managed the social architecture of Ashwick House with the quiet precision of a woman who had spent 40 years understanding that social architecture was the only architecture she was permitted to build. She was not a cruel person. She was a thorough one. She understood exactly what each person in her sphere was and was not. and she administered her understanding with the confidence of someone who has never been wrong enough times to doubt the instrument. She had been managing Lord Ashwick's social obligations since his wife's death. She had identified Miss Cecily Drummond as a suitable prospect in August and had been engineering proximity since September with the patience and method of a woman who plays a long game because she has always played a long game. Miss Drummond was not wrong for the position. She was fair and graceful and quietly intelligent. And she was, by every measure that Lady Constance's accounting used, the correct choice. What Lady Constance had not planned for was Dotty. She understood this. She understood it the way she understood most things. Clearly, without sentiment, and without the capacity to do anything useful about it. She was the wrong element in a household that had been very carefully balanced. Her father had made her wrong for it by teaching her to read Latin and think like a solicitor and care about the truth of things. And she could no more unmake that than she could unmake her own face. It was on the third morning after the letter that Lady Constance spoke her first word on the matter, in what she believed was a private aside to Mrs. Elton, the housekeeper, on the landing outside the blue sitting room. Dotty was carrying a basin down the service corridor, and the wall carried sound in that particular stretch of the house in a way that Lady Constance had never had occasion to discover. "The girl is a servant who overreaches," Lady Constance said. Her voice was not unkind. It was precise. She does not understand what she is, and households that allow that confusion always pay for it. Mrs. Elton said something low that Dotty did not catch. "I am not suggesting anything hasty," Lady Constance said. "Before the quarter. That is time enough." Dotty set the basin down on the corridor table and stood for a moment with her eyes on the wall. Then she picked it up again and continued down the passage. There was nothing to be done with the information except to hold it alongside the rest of what she knew. And she had grown very practiced at that particular exercise. It was 2 days after this that the glasses broke. Thomas Peel was 17 and had been in service for 8 months and was still, in the language of the household, finding his feet. He had been carrying a tray of crystal down the service stair when he caught the edge of the banister wrong. Dotty heard the sound from the landing, a high, terrible music, and came around the corner to find him standing in the middle of the wreckage with the expression of someone calculating the end of their employment. She looked at him. She looked at the glasses. She thought of his mother in Cheapside, whom he had mentioned once over the servants' hall supper, who depended on what he sent home. "Go," she said. "I was bringing them down. I will tell Mrs. Elton myself." He stared at her. "Go," she said again, quietly. And he went. She was on her knees collecting the larger pieces when she became aware that she was not alone in the corridor. She did not look up at once. She finished gathering the glass into the tray, rose and turned. Lord Ashwick stood at the far end of the passage. He had come from his study. He had a letter in his hand, which he had apparently forgotten, and he was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not the careful nullity he wore in the drawing-room, not the remote courtesy of the great staircase. Something else. Something that had not had time to arrange itself. "Miss Marsh," he said. His voice was even, as it always was. "My lord?" She held the tray. Her hands were steady. "You were not carrying those glasses." She met his eyes. "There was an accident, my lord. I am managing it." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the tray, and then back at her face, and something in his expression shifted in the way that a barely perceptible tremor precedes a larger settling, not visible to anyone who had not been watching closely, and she had been watching closely for 10 weeks. "You will not be docked," he said. "Speak to Mrs. Elton. I will inform her it was an accident." He turned and went back toward the study. At the study door he paused, and she saw him look down at the letter in his hand as if he had forgotten what it was. Then he went in and closed the door. Dottie stood in the corridor with the tray of broken glass and pressed the sole of her shoe carefully against the floor to feel that she was still standing on it. If you have ever watched a restrained man, one who holds himself at great cost, discover that someone in his house is quietly principled, you will know that the discovery is not a dramatic event. It is a door opened half an inch in an interior room. It admits almost no light. It changes everything. She noticed it in the days that followed. He did not speak of it. He would not have. It was not his register. He began, nonetheless, to redirect small attentions toward her with the same quality of care with which he handled anything he did not want to break. He asked her, once, to read a passage aloud from a document when his spectacles were mislaid. Not the housekeeper, not Lady Constance. Her, and the word he used was please, which she had not heard him use to any servant. He said her name once in the gallery, when he needed to direct her around a scaffolded section of the east wall, and said it the way one says a word one has been thinking and has not yet decided whether to speak. She received all of this into the place inside her, where she kept things she was not permitted to act on, and the place grew very crowded. It was on a Thursday evening, the 3rd week of November, that she saw the thing that reorganized everything she had, until then, only suspected. The household had retired early. Lord Ashwick had dismissed the footmen at 9 and gone up to the portrait gallery, which he did sometimes in the evenings, and which the other servants had learned to leave undisturbed. Dottie had gone to the gallery herself with a specific errand. There was a window latch at the far end that Mrs. Elton had asked her to check before the night's cold settled in, and she had come up the service stair and turned into the long corridor and seen the light under the gallery door and checked herself without fully deciding to. She looked through the gap where the door stood half open. He was standing before the portrait of his late wife. It hung between the 2 north windows, a formal piece in the style of 10 years prior. The late Marchioness rendered in pale silk against a dark background, her expression composed in the particular way of women who are being painted and know it. Dottie had passed the portrait many times and thought she was kind. She had no evidence for this. It was the kind of thing you saw in a face if you were the kind of person who looked. Lord Ashwick stood with his hands at his sides and his back to the door, and he was very still. He said something that she could not fully hear, not performing, not rehearsing, simply saying it. The way one speaks in a room where no one is listening except the room itself. She caught only the end. I could not tell you. His hand moved to his breast pocket. He touched the corner of something there. A fold of paper. She could see the edge of it from the doorway. And then he lowered his hand without taking it out, and stood again in his particular stillness, and then turned and left by the far door. She stood in the corridor for a long moment. The window latch at the far end was cold under her fingers when she finally reached it. She attended to it with care, and did not allow herself to think about what she had seen until she was back in her own room with the door shut and the candle burning and the house settling around her into its night sounds. He was carrying a letter. He had been carrying it since the first week she arrived. She now understood. The corner of it visible at his pocket's edge when he moved, tucked close against him like something that needed keeping warm. And the shape of his grief, which she had been reading for 10 weeks in every set of his jaw and every careful modulation of his voice, was not the grief of a man who blamed the woman in the portrait. It was the grief of a man who blamed himself. She understood this with the particular sharpness of recognition, because it was the same structure her own grief had taken after her father died, and she had spent a year cataloging every conversation in which she might have managed things differently. In the evenings, when the household had settled, and Lady Constance was at her needlework, and the Marquis had retired to his study, Dotty sat with the weight of what she knew, and turned over the problem the way she had once turned over the mathematical problems her father set her, looking for the clean edge, the point at which the given terms could be rearranged into something soluble. Mr. Prewett. The name was in the letter. She knew the firm, Prewett and Callow, Gray's Inn Road. She had seen the letterhead on other documents in the house. The family solicitor. He came when summoned on household matters. She could not go to him. She could not write to him. She had no standing. What she had was the household ledgers, which were her responsibility to maintain and collate for Lady Constance's quarterly review. And the ledgers had, in the Eastern accounts, a running query about a property lease from 3 years prior that had never been fully resolved. A minor matter, the kind of thing a solicitor could settle with one letter if someone thought to ask. She had been meaning to bring it to someone's attention for a month. She brought it to Lady Constance's attention. She phrased it as a household matter requiring legal confirmation, suggested that Mr. Prewett be written to, and laid the relevant pages on the desk. Lady Constance looked at them briefly. "Yes, all right," she said. "Write the inquiry. I will sign it." Dotty wrote the inquiry. She dated it to arrive mid-month. She wrote it carefully, accurately, entirely without impropriety, every word true, every detail correct, and the appointment she requested falling on the 23rd of November, which was the date she had calculated from the household diary, was the most likely day for Lady Constance to schedule the dismissal interview. She had no certainty it would work. She had no certainty it would not. She had done what she could do without lying, without betraying, without speaking one word. She had no right to speak. Then she waited. Miss Drummond came to dinner on the 15th. She was everything the season had designated as correct. She was fair-haired, graceful, at ease in candlelight, the sort of young woman who wore silk without appearing to notice it, and whose conversation landed cleanly and without effort. She was 20 years old, and she had the comfortable social confidence of someone who had never in her life wondered whether she belonged in the room she was standing in. Lady Constance had placed her at Lord Ashwick's right hand. She had placed Dotty at the service position near the sideboard. This was not unusual. It was accurate to their positions. Dotty stood near the sideboard and did her work, and kept her expression precisely level. It was Miss Drummond who first addressed the table's fuller attention to her. She had not done it deliberately. She was describing a situation at another household, a story about a presumptuous footman, light and social, a story the table was already beginning to enjoy when she used the phrase without thinking, as one uses a phrase that is already in the common language, the vocabulary of the room. "One of those servants who overreaches," she said. The table murmured with comfortable recognition. Lady Constance's eyes moved once, briefly, to Dotty, and then away. Lord Ashwick's hand, which had been moving his glass a half-inch to the left in the particular small fidget Dotty had observed him perform when he was thinking about something else, stopped. He did not look at Miss Drummond. He did not look at Dotty. He looked at the tablecloth. And then he looked at Mr. Aldwych across from him and asked him a question about the autumn rents, and the table shifted current and moved on. Dotty set down the decanter she had lifted and stood for a moment with her hands loose at her sides. His hand had stopped. She had seen it stop. The dinner continued around her. She returned to her work with the methodical steadiness that was the only performance she had ever been able to sustain convincingly, the reflex of a woman who has learned to keep her face smooth at moments when her interior is anything but. The silver was cool in her hands. The candles threw their warm, uneven light across the tablecloth, and caught the glass and the jewelry and the animated faces of Lady Constance's guests, 12 of them tonight, the room at its best performance. Miss Drummond was speaking again, something about her sister's season, her voice carrying the particular ease of a woman who has never not been listened to. Lord Ashwick was attending to her with the courtesy he attended to everything, his face in its working expression, giving nothing away. His hand had moved the glass back. Dotty had been watching him for 10 weeks, and she knew what the glass was. It was the thing he reached for when he was managing something, the small controlled motion that kept his hands occupied while his mind worked elsewhere. He did not drink from it more than once in a sitting. It was a prop, and she had understood it to be a prop since the second dinner she had served at. He had moved it back, and his eyes, when they had moved down to the tablecloth, had held for 2 seconds on a point that corresponded to nothing anyone else at the table was doing. And then he had asked about the rents, and the table had moved on, and Miss Drummond had smiled, and the candlelight had caught the fair arrangement of her hair, and everything in the room was as it was supposed to be. Dotty carried the decanter to the sideboard. She stood at her station. She did the work. Behind her eyes. In the quiet room she kept separate from the room she was standing in, she held what she had seen, and she held what she knew, and she made no conclusions she was not entitled to make. She was very careful about what she was entitled to. It was not enough. It was nothing. It was everything her position permitted her to know about his interior, and she folded it carefully away. The morning of the 23rd came in gray and cold, the sky the color of pewter, the first suggestion of snow in the air. Mrs. Elton came to Dotty at 7:30 in the servants' hall, while Dotty was eating her breakfast. She sat down across from her with the particular expression of someone doing a thing they would prefer not to do. "Lady Constance will see you at 9, Mrs. Elton said. She asked me to tell you. She said—" Mrs. Elton paused. She was a decent woman, and she was not comfortable. "She said to tell you it has been decided that you are a servant who overreaches, and that Lord Ashwick concurs with the recommendation." Thomas, at the far end of the hall, looked up from his tea. He looked at Dotty. Dotty looked at her bowl. "Thank you, Mrs. Elton," she said. "I am sorry, Miss Marsh," Mrs. Elton said quietly, and meant it. "It is all right." Dotty picked up her spoon. She set it down again. "Is there any word of when Mr. Prewett is expected?" Mrs. Elton blinked. "The solicitor? He sent a note this morning. He will be here at 9:30. "Yes," Dotty said. "Thank you." She went to her room, and she sat on the edge of her narrow bed, and she breathed in and out for a long time. She had done what she could do. She had arranged what she could arrange. Whatever happened now would happen without her being in the room, because she was never going to be permitted in the room, and that was the nature of her situation, and she had always known it. She packed her trunk. She was methodical about it. She had very little, and it did not take long. Her father's copy of Blackstone, which she had no business carrying as a lady's maid, and had carried anyway because she could not leave it. 2 gowns, the better one folded on top. Her hairpins in the small dish she had brought from Shropshire. A letter from her cousin in Bath, unanswered. She had been meaning to answer it. She would answer it now, she supposed, from wherever she was going next. She sat on the bed for a moment when she was done. The room was small and had never been comfortable in the way that comfortable rooms are. It had been functional, which was what she had needed it to be, and she had made a kind of peace with its slant ceiling and its single window that looked into the courtyard. She had stood at that window many times in the early mornings, and looked into the courtyard and thought about nothing in particular, and felt in the specific quality of that nothing that she was where she was supposed to be. She would not permit herself sentiment. She was a schoolmaster's daughter, and she knew the difference between what a thing felt like and what it was. She picked up her trunk and carried it downstairs herself. Mr. Pruitt arrived at 9:30 as promised, was ushered to the waiting room, and made it known through the footman that he had brought documents pertaining to several household matters that required the Marquis's attention. The footman brought this word to Lady Constance, who was in the blue sitting room with Dottie's letter of dismissal on the writing table, and Lady Constance sent back word that Mr. Pruitt was to wait, and she would arrange for a meeting in the estate room after the morning's other business. Lord Ashwick, coming down the main stair at 20 minutes to 10 with the particular gathered quality of a man who intends to begin his working day, encountered Mr. Pruitt in the hall. He stopped. "Pruitt," he said, "I did not know you were expected." "I believed I had your household's invitation, my lord," Pruitt said, and there was something careful in his voice, something that had been waiting. Lord Ashwick looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "Come into the study." He closed the door. He did not emerge for 40 minutes. Dottie was in the entrance hall with her trunk at the foot of the stairs when the study door opened. She had brought it down herself because it was not heavy, and she had not wanted to ask Thomas to do it. She was standing beside it with her cloak on and her gloves in her hands, and she was looking at the tiles of the entrance hall floor, which were a pattern of black and white she had memorized in her first week and never needed to look at again. And she was looking at them now because she needed something to look at. That was not the stairs. Lady Constance appeared from the corridor to her right. Miss Drummond, who had returned for a morning call, was behind her. Two of the parlor maids were visible at the far end of the hall, lingering over a task they had found ways to extend. Thomas stood at his station at the front door, very still. The study door opened. Lord Ashwick crossed the entrance hall in 7 strides. He moved the way he always moved, with the disciplined economy of a man who has learned not to waste what he has, but there was something different in the quality of his motion, a directness, as if something that had been standing between him and the place he intended to go had been removed. He stopped in front of her. Lady Constance said, "Richard, the girl's notice has been—" "She is not dismissed," he said. His voice was level. It was always level. It was directed at Dottie and not at Lady Constance, and its quality was different from any register she had heard him use before. "She stays, and she stays as my wife." The entrance hall was silent. Miss Drummond took one step back. It was small, automatic, the instinctive recalibration of a person updating her understanding of a room. Lady Constance said nothing. Her fan was in her hand, and she was not opening it. Something moved across her face. Not anger, Dottie thought, but the specific expression of a person who has miscalculated and is only now beginning to understand by how much. After a long moment, she said quietly, "I overstepped." It was all she said, and she said it with a kind of precision that surprised Dottie, as if she meant it, as if the acknowledgement cost her something and she was paying it anyway, because she was not, underneath her maneuvering, a dishonest woman. Behind Lord Ashwick, in the hall doorway, Mr. Pruitt cleared his throat softly. "My lord," he said, "when you are ready, there are papers to review." He glanced at Dottie once, briefly, with an expression she could not read, and she thought that whatever had passed in the study had moved him, had moved through him like a current, and that he would carry the weight of what had been allowed to be hidden for 6 weeks, for a long time afterward. Lord Ashwick had not stopped looking at her. Dottie stood with her gloves in her hands and her trunk at her feet, and she looked back at him. She was aware of the room around her, the parlor maids at the corridor's edge, Thomas at the door, the weight of Lady Constance's silence, the snow that had begun outside the tall windows, the first snow of the season catching the gray morning light, and she was aware of none of it in the way she was aware of him. "Your Grace," she said, and her voice was steady, because she was Dorothy Marsh, and she had not come this far by anything other than being steady. "I should tell you that I did not." "I know," he said. He had very little ornamentation, his speech. "I know what you did, and what you did not do." He held out his hand. Behind her, she was aware of Thomas at the door, standing as still as she had ever seen him stand, his youth visible in the way his face had not yet learned to hold itself neutral. Beyond him, through the tall windows on either side of the entrance, the snow was coming down in earnest now, the first full snowfall of the year, the light of it soft and particular and northern and entirely indifferent to what was happening inside the hall. Lady Constance had not left. She was still in the corridor's entrance, her fan in her closed hand, her expression settled now into something that was not pride and not contrition, but something between the two. The expression, Dotty thought, of a woman who has made a decision about how she is going to carry a thing she cannot change. Miss Drummond was looking at the floor with the careful attention of someone who has decided to be elsewhere in every way available to her, without moving her feet. The two parlor maids at the corridor's edge were entirely still. One of them had a cloth in her hands that she had stopped pretending to use. The entrance hall of Ashwick House had 17 tiles across its widest point, black and white in alternating pattern, worn smooth at the center by 100 years of foot traffic, and Dotty had crossed it twice a day for 3 months without once standing at the center of it and being seen by every person in it. She was at the center of it now. She had no precedent for what she did next. She had no position that authorized it, no rank that warranted it, no protocol that named it. She put her gloved hand in his. That evening the snow was falling in earnest past the windows of the small sitting room at the back of the house. The room was lit by the fire and by 3 candles on the mantelpiece, and it was the room that Dotty had always understood to be the room the Marquis used when he did not wish to perform anything for anyone. The one room in the house that was not arranged for an audience. He had asked her to sit. She sat. He remained standing for a time, and then he sat also, in the chair opposite. And the fire was between them, and the snow was outside, and the house was quiet around them, with the particular quality of quiet that falls over a household after a great deal of weather has passed. He reached into the breast pocket of his coat. He removed the folded letter. She had seen it there every day for 10 weeks. The edge of it, the worn fold, the way the paper had softened with long carrying. And she had never known what it was until she had read the other letter and understood. He looked at it for a long moment. He did not speak. The fire shifted. Outside, the snow came down in long, level lines past the glass. He opened it. She watched him read. She did not look away. His face moved through several things she had not seen on it before. A tightening first, the jaw that had its habit of holding, and then something that was not the tightening, something that was the opposite of the tightening. A release at the outer corners of his eyes and the set of his mouth. The slow unlocking of something that had been closed for a long time. He read it once. He read it again. She heard him draw one breath. That was not the same as the breaths he had been drawing before. He did not tell her what it said. She did not need to be told. She understood. From everything she had learned about Eliza through the shape of his grief, that the letter would not be accusation. Eliza had been the kind of person who paid a debt in secret to spare her husband the asking. She would not have written accusation. He folded the letter. He looked at it in his hands. Then he looked across at Dotty. "She would have liked you," he said. It was the quietest thing she had ever heard him say. Dottie did not speak. The fire was warm. The snow was at the window. He extended his hand, and she took the letter from him, carefully, in both of hers, and held it as one holds a thing that has been trusted to you, which is differently from how one holds a thing one has taken without leave. She understood the distinction. She had been living inside it for 3 weeks. Thomas appeared at the sitting room door with a tray of tea. He was trying very hard not to smile and not fully succeeding. He set the tray on the low table and withdrew with the careful industry of someone very young who has just understood that things are going to be all right. She had read the forbidden letter, and she had not been able to unknow what it contained, and the knowing had cost her 3 weeks of careful sleepless navigation and had very nearly cost her the position she needed and the house she had. She now permitted herself to understand, been thinking of as something approaching home. 2 letters. She held one, he had opened the other. Between them, on a November evening with the first snow of the season at the glass and the fire warm and the tea cooling gently on the table, they had between them now no secrets they had not chosen to keep, and no knowledge that sat in either of them like something swallowed without permission. The snow fell. The candles burned. The Marquis of Ashwick reached for the teapot and poured for them both. And she, who was not dismissed, who was not nobody, who had always been precisely as valuable as her father's education had made her, and as the one man in this house had been clear-eyed enough to see, watched him do it, and felt, for the first time in a very long time, that the knowledge inside her was a gift rather than a burden. If this story moved you as it moved me in the telling, leave a word in the comments. There are more evenings like this one waiting, more women like Dorothy, more letters that change everything. Thank you for sitting with her until the end.